We'll spend the next few minutes discussing prophetic literature, the biblical office of the prophet, and then prophecy in the ancient Near East. Our biblical books that comprise our prophetic corpus include Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. There are three common Hebrew terms that are translated into English as prophet. Hosea and roeh, two terms, both related to the verb to see. Perhaps even a better English translation as opposed to prophet is seer. And then nabi, which you read in your textbooks. Here, this term is related to the verb to call. The meanings here help us to understand how the ancients perceived our prophets. They saw the things of Yahweh, and they were called by Yahweh. Our prophets indeed were the very voice of Yahweh to the people. They spoke on our deity's behalf. So we have littered throughout our prophetic books the formulaic expressions, "Thus says Yahweh," or "This is what Yahweh says." A prophecy, then, is a message from Yahweh, or a proclamation from Yahweh's perspective. Our biblical prophets are both forthtellers and foretellers. You read this in your textbook. Forthtellers meaning they tell forth Yahweh's truth to their own generation. Foretellers indicating that they tell Yahweh's revelation of a future intention. That future may be either in the near future or distant future. Now, the purpose of foretelling by our biblical prophets was to motivate those in the present. With this in mind, the entire message of the prophet was first and foremost wrapped up into the present context. As we approach the prophetic text, we need to first examine the message to the current generation, answering why this message to this people. Let's answer now, who are our biblical prophets? The beginnings of the role of the prophet seems to have been introduced with Moses, though Abraham is once described as a prophet in Genesis 20, verse 7. Moses is never officially titled as a prophet, but he does get grouped together with prophets in a few texts, and he speaks of himself as one in Deuteronomy 18:15. He also has multiple God encounters or theophanies that seem to hail him as a prophet. The next prophetic role that we've read about has been that of Samuel. Certainly he was called Nabi by God in 1 Samuel 1 through 3, and then we spoke of him or read about him in our readings as both a judge and a prophet. Now, the office of the prophet takes an even clearer form when Elijah emerges on the scene in 1 Kings. These individuals that fill this office, there are others that we haven't mentioned: Nathan, Deborah, Elisha. These prophets are considered pre-classical prophets. They are the forerunners to classical prophecy. Our classical prophets then include those books that I read earlier, Isaiah through Malachi. These prophets prophesied during approximately 800 to 450 BCE, the years attesting the fall of the northern and southern kingdoms, also the rebuilding of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. We'll come back to describing our context in just a moment. In addition to our pre-classical prophets and classical prophets, there were also prophets that never wrote anything down, or their materials have been lost. We know of them, but we have no written record. And so here we refer to them as the non-literary prophets. So for example, Ahijah, who's mentioned in 1 Kings, that condemned Jeroboam's northern and southern cults with the calves. Remember Dan and Bethel. We don't have Ahijah's oracles, just the events about him. Also Micaiah in 1 Kings, Huldah in 2 Kings, and there are many others to be sure. This does beg the question, I think, why is it that we have anything written down in the first place, since our prophets communicated orally? Maybe they wrote down what they spoke. Maybe they had a scribe. Maybe they had disciples who wrote and collected their works and organized them. Nonetheless, we have this written material of our classical prophets. As our classical prophets emerge, we can ask why. Why the prophets? Well, our prophets were Yahweh's voice when Israel and Judah needed it most. The theological setting for the prophets is embedded in the question, would Israel and Judah return to Yahweh, their God, or would they embrace false religious faith? Let's discuss briefly now prophecy around ancient Israel, and then we'll come back to our biblical prophets. The ancient Near East was very prophetic. A vast amount of literature is attested, actually, prophetic literature. And I'll discuss three especially significant types of prophetic literature that have come up so far. So the first are called aNE texts. These are primarily Babylonian, dated 2000 to 1595 BCE. And aNE texts are recordings of interrelated events. So the Babylonians recorded observations around them. The belief was that one event caused another, a cause and effect worldview. So, for example, they might say, well, the last time a king died, just prior, a white horse died. So, if a white horse dies, then the king is going to die. There are other omens. If a certain bird flies by a certain place, famine, okay? Interrelated events, cause and effect. I was trying to think of a modern day example, and this is what I've come up with. Our Punxsutawney Phil, Groundhog Day, maybe the closest thing we have to kind of cause and effect worldview or interrelated events of sorts. So take it as you will. All right. Another group of ancient Near Eastern prophetic texts come from Mari. Mari is located on the Euphrates, north. These texts are during approximately the same time period as the Babylonian aNE texts. Now at Mari, we have attested prophets labeled as ecstatics. The Akkadian is muhu. These prophets seem to have a bit of the crazies. The role, however, of these ecstatics was simply to deliver messages that they received via dreams, visions, etc. And each ecstatic served a specific deity. So, despite the case of the crazies, the prophets in Mari actually have several parallels in the biblical prophetic corpus. Especially, one of the terms that's attested at Mari that denotes a prophet, in addition to this muhu, which means ecstatic, is nabu, as you see here. It is the same term that we have in Hebrew, designating the prophet, meaning called, so related to the verb to call. Now, from a later period, in the first millennium, we have a collection of Akkadian texts. These prophetic, I'd put that in quotes if you could see me, these prophetic texts list political events and appear to be about the future. For example, the text might say, a certain king will do such and will attack so and so. The question is whether or not these texts are actually prophetic. And in fact, the corpus is labeled, as you see here with the Latin, vaticinium ex eventu. We believe that they were, in fact, written after the fact to legitimize what happened. Interesting prophetic corpus for sure. Well, let's move back to our biblical prophets. What can we say about our biblical prophets, especially in relation to those of the ancient Near East? I know that I've covered this just briefly, so allow me some conclusions to make with you all. Our biblical prophets addressed the whole nation, not just the rulers. This is really unique to biblical prophecy. Our biblical prophets also spoke to everyone, to young and old, rich and poor, the commoners, priests, not just the kings and the princes. Our biblical prophets sought an inner moral change of the heart, and this is something that's going to just become so sweet to you, I think, as you read these prophetic books with me. Not just a simple adherence to a sacrificial system, but a moral change of the heart. Our biblical prophets called people, following these lines, called people to be holy as Yahweh is holy. Finally, the biblical prophets looked to the present, but also the future, in that they called people to live lives pleasing to God, not only for themselves, but for the sake of all who would come after them. Well, let's set ourselves up for the next couple of weeks that we will spend together and place our prophets into their historical setting. And this is, in fact, how we will discuss the prophets as we move forward. So we will address those that prophesied during the Assyrian period, or the period that Assyrian was dominating the Levant area. And then we'll move into the Babylonian domination, and then finally during the Persian rule. So the Assyrian domination period. Remember, it was Assyria who first made her presence known in our northern kingdom. It was under the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III that part of the northern territories were being assumed. And then under Shalmaneser V that the northern kingdom fell. Our biblical prophets who prophesied during this particular period include Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Jonah, Micah, and we believe Nahum as well. As we move forward, recall that the Assyrian domination fell to the Babylonians, and so it was Nebuchadnezzar that sacked our southern kingdom, including Jerusalem. Our biblical prophets who prophesied during this time, this period of Babylonian domination, include Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Obadiah, we believe, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. Finally, in our historical record, Persia dominates Babylon, and it is under Persian rule that some of our exiles were allowed to return to Jerusalem. So during this Persian rule, the prophets who ministered include Joel, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So as we move forward, this is how we will study these prophetic books in their historical order. And this is why it was so important for us to really get a grasp of the divided kingdom and how it all went down, because now we're going to go right back into that history and very systematically and chronologically place our prophets back into history.